Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this interview, we talk to C. Crowle about the recently published and expanded edition of Attack International's text, The Spirit of Freedom, Anti-Colonial War and Uneasy Peace in Ireland. The new edition includes the original, unabridged 1989 text by Attack International and some great supplementary material compiled by Crowle. The book is a concise and powerful text on the national liberation struggle in Ireland from the perspective of radicals in the UK. It's a text that challenges us to think critically about how people in an imperial center practice solidarity with the masses under the yoke of colonialism. We discuss different facets of the Irish context, including the revitalization of the armed movement in Ireland in the 1960s, the prisoner hunger strikes, and some of the different strands of Irish nationalism and Ulster Unionism. We also talk about Attack International's critical analysis of the shortcomings and problems with the anti-imperialist solidarity movement in Great Britain during the period of Irish armed struggle. This episode was recorded all the way back on November 7th, 2023. So while we discuss Western liberalism, mainstream media narratives, and the Western left with regards to Palestine, many of the questions we raised we didn't fully flesh out, and are topics we've covered more deeply in many of our conversations since. Having said that, one cannot help but ponder the resonances between the failures of the British left in supporting Irish liberation with the failures of the Western left to materially impact the genocide on Palestinians and to support the Palestinian liberation struggle. We close by talking about the very real prospects for United Ireland, what that might mean, and some of Crowle's assessments of Irish republicanism today. Crowle published this book, and their online bookstore is leftwingbooks.net. They are based in Canada and are having a 25% off sale during the Canada Post strike, because shipments will be delayed. Solidarity to the striking postal workers. I highly encourage people to check out their catalog, and in addition to The Spirit of Freedom, I will include some books that I love from them in the show description. We have a current discount for new patrons. You can get 20% off your first month if you sign up for a monthly subscription, or 20% off your first year if you sign up for a yearly membership by using the code A7E32 when you sign up at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. You can now also give a membership to our Patreon as a gift if you know someone who would enjoy that this holiday season. We'll include a link for that in the show description as well. Our George Jackson Blood in My Eye study group will be available for patrons who support the show at any level. We are going to meet to discuss the book weekly on Thursday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time starting December 12th. Comrades from the George Jackson Organizing School will also be joining us for these discussions. Now, here's our conversation on Attack International's The Spirit of Freedom. All right, so first of all, Casey, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's our first time having you on the show, although we've featured work from Crowle, which is the publisher that published the book we're talking about today. You work there, I believe, too. And so we've done books that you've been a part of publishing, and we are huge fans. I mean, just on a personal level, and I say this for our audience too. You are one of our favorite publishers, and we really appreciate the work that you all do and hope folks support your work as a publisher, but also leftwingbooks.net, which I know is the bookstore wing of the work that you all do. You guys have great collections and, do great work. So thank you so much for that. We've done study groups in the past on night vision and on James Yaki Sale's book, Meditations on the Wretched of the Earth. And I'm probably forgetting another one, but we've at least done those as group readings. So, and I know that you didn't publish the original versions of those texts, but you helped republish them recently, and that's a huge contribution. So thank you for that. So before we get into this, introduce yourself a little bit to our audience.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I'm Casey. I'm based in Montreal, which is known as Jojage. It's the occupied land of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, which most people would know as the Mohawk Nation. They're members of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. I, too, am a fan of Crowle. I really can't take credit for most of it. I sort of was a fan and started working there in the past few years. So very much don't feel like I represent the project, but I'm happy to contribute to it. Yeah, maybe just as a little more situating myself. I'm a cis white man. My parents are teachers. I don't have a university degree, and I've mostly worked in manual labor and undertaken study kind of informally on my own. I come into radical politics through anarchism. I feel a bit disaffected with that term these days, but yeah, I like the term culturally anarchist. Definitely like my political circles are mostly anarchist, and my closest people are often people who are also culturally anarchist, but have some frustrations.
Right on. So this specific book we're talking about today is a republication of a book by an organization called Attack International. It's called The Spirit of Freedom, Anti-Colonial War and Uneasy Peace in Ireland. Could you just say a little bit about Attack and who they were and kind of what this book was originally, how it was originally composed, what it was composed of, and what it was kind of seeking to do as you understand it in the period it was written?
Mm-hmm. So it comes out of 1989 and was called then The Spirit of Freedom, The War in Ireland. We changed it for this edition because arguably there's no longer a war. Yeah, so Attack International is a small, mostly agitational, as I understand it, like putting out materials, propaganda in the sort of libertarian, anarchist, communist tradition scene. And they specifically they were strongly in solidarity with Irish liberation, Irish decolonization, and wanted to make an intervention that sort of cut across a binary they felt caught between and didn't like, of sort of an anti-nationalist, anarchist position of sort of like nations are bad, let's just do class organizing, and sort of a hard anti-imperialist or like unnuanced anti-imperialist camp, or traditionalist Republican that was just sort of like, we are 100% behind the IRA. Anything the IRA does is right. Anything that furthers the cause of Irish nationalism is right. They quote, towards the end of the book, they quote, I think it's Militant, as saying, we would support the IRA 100%, even if it was entirely priests and nuns. And so they're wanting to kind of introduce more of a class critique towards the anti-imperialist side, and more of a kind of, here's why simplistic anti-nationalism isn't real. It's not connected to the real world of struggle.
And maybe within that context too, could you just say a little bit of like what was like in 1989, like kind of what were the things that were, I mean, we'll probably get to this a little bit more later, but like what were some of the key things that were going on then in the struggle? Obviously, this is before the Good Friday Agreement. It's before a lot of the important sort of political shifts, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more later. But yeah, maybe just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so 1989 is kind of the earliest people would start talking in hindsight about the peace process beginning, like right around 88, 89. But obviously at the time, no one was talking about a peace process. Like it's just sort of barely beginning. The IRA wouldn't go on truce until 1994. Good Friday Agreement is 1998. Throughout most of the latter half of the 80s, you have the British state term was an acceptable level of violence. You sort of had greatly reduced numbers of deaths, numbers of disruptions to life, and sort of there was a bit of a stalemate, a military stalemate that had developed between the IRA and the British Army. Of course, people were still being killed, both by loyalist paramilitaries who were primarily targeting random Catholic civilians, or IRA volunteers killed on operation or in targeted ambushes. Targeted ambushes would be mostly by the British Army. And the IRA, of course, had operations targeting British security forces, whether police or military or different things like that. Yeah, and Spirit of Freedom is sort of explicitly talking about that beginning of a peace process, that beginning of a dialogue between Sinn Féin and the British state that was sort of on the horizon. And over the course of the 80s, there had been an increasing role for Sinn Féin, which in the early 70s is basically to the IRA what something like the ELF press office was, if people know about that, was in the US in the late 90s and early 2000s. Sort of we are the place that can have a physical office, and we can put out a press release, and we can sort of contextualize the struggle or put up posters or whatever, but we're mostly doing propaganda in furtherance of the IRA struggle. And over the course of the 80s, particularly from the 1981 hunger strikes, they become much more of a, not fully independent, there's never like a full separation, but it develops more of an apparatus and more of a role and more of a perspective that is sometimes in tension with the IRA. And I should say, though, that while they were both like united as part of a Republican movement, there's also tons of crossover in terms of membership. So they're like not separate organizations, even at the level of membership.
Right on. So say a little bit about the process then of kind of republishing this. Now we're 3 decades on, plus, and you've done some work here to add some of the important political shifts and changes and, necessary caveats looking back at this in hindsight. You write contributions both in introduction and afterward, or preface, I think, and afterward, and with a set of, kind of notes and like contextual pieces that are added throughout. So I'm wondering, what's that process like, and what to you and for Spleved made it worthy of republishing, which is to say, are there political interventions it makes that you think are still really important ones, or perhaps it's also that it's an important example of a certain type of political writing that we would love to see more of in our own context? Or, I'm just interested in kind of what the thinking was around doing a republication and the work that you all did on it.
Mm-hmm. We in the broad sense, not me, I wasn't a part of it then, but Crowle republished it as a pamphlet in the late 90s or early 2000s. And so we had kind of kept distroing it, and partly, I think, due to me getting involved and partly due to just the passage of time, it increasingly seemed like something that needed a bit more context around it. It's getting into 30 years out of date. And it's written in a very up to the minute, like live, this is a real struggle going on. And that's one of the things that I love about it. Like it's a real intervention in a precise historical moment, but also grounded in enough history to give people a sense of where things have gotten to, why they've gotten to there, where things are coming from in order to understand where they're going. And I love that about it. I love that model of political intervention that is oriented to action, oriented to like pressing issues right now, but also with a sense of history. And I still think that intervention that I was talking about before of kind of critiquing simplistic anti-nationalism and critiquing simplistic anti-imperialism, still very necessary. Like right now, we're a month into the latest round of assaults on Gaza by the Israeli state, and the reaction kind of discourse around that has felt a lot of people wanting to just like, well, let's just condemn both sides, or let's just condemn military action from both sides, or let's just pick our team and whatever. Anyone who's picking the IDF, like, fuck them. But people who I would broadly consider comrades sort of wanting to cheerlead in a way that it's just not good politics, like I think we need to find a way of doing genuine solidarity and not presuming to know that we know best from our positions in the imperial core, how people should defend themselves and struggle for liberation at the same time as staying true to political principles, like sort of a running balance in this, as in all things, between a purity politics where you only do things with people who are exactly like you, think exactly like you, and not just being blown around in the wind by whoever meets some bare bones criteria and just being like, these are my people 100%. Maybe I'll also just add, there are inevitably young radicals, usually young white guys like myself, or like myself was when I started learning about Ireland, who want to learn about Ireland. And I think this is a good introduction because it's brief, because it's punchy, and because it brings some of those critiques from the get-go. I think a lot of times people get sort of socialized or whatever. They get trained in either the orthodox Republican line or some very simplistic versions of the struggle. And, it's good to just plant the seeds of that nuance from the beginning while also offering, an accessible introduction.
One of the things that you do talk about in your preface is how white folks in Canada or the US specifically, not solely, of course, but those of us that have Irish heritage, that the identification with IRA history or the Republican or anti-colonial Irish movement can be what you call a sort of move to innocence. And I also, I reflected on this for myself because, at a certain point, in different points in time, I've sort of more deeply identified with the cause of Irish people and resistance to British colonialism, even though any serious look, and Rolston and McVeigh also talk about this within the Irish context, which I think is interesting because for them, they both acknowledge that making a clear distinction within their families is complicated because there's either British heritage or loyalist heritage as well as Irish heritage. And so any identification essentially becomes a political choice as opposed to some sort of like ethnic heritage that you can hold on to as like something like indigeneity or something like that, And so, that was always complicated for me as well, while still having, I think, some political utility as well, and it's convenient, I think, to use Ireland as an anti-colonial reference point for white folks. But yeah, grappling with those histories kind of unsettles how easy that is, especially when you think about the role of Irish settlers within even if they came under dire circumstances, initially, a lot of them, their roles in the United States and Canada and Australia and other places in terms of their involvement in imperialism and settler colonialism and so on. And so anyways, you highlight some of those dynamics in the text. And I wondered if you could share a bit about your own journey here and the importance of the Irish context as a kind of political reference point for European descendants in other contexts, but also the limitations or problematics of that reference point, specifically where we are in North America.
Yeah, one of the things I say in the preface, and kind of one of the main points of the preface, is that Attack International was writing to British people, and this book is mostly going to be read by people in North America, and people in North America are much more likely to identify with the Irish. And part of the point of a text is to get, British radicals, revolutionaries, working class people to identify with the struggle of the Irish. And that's a slam dunk in North America. Everybody wants to identify with the oppressed Irish in North America. And I often think I should read more about this as a phenomenon, but I feel like I lived it in the 90s and 2000s of Ireland just being very cool and Irish stuff being very cool. In high school, I was listening to a lot of the Dropkick Murphys and Flogging Molly, and those bands were on Warped Tour and people loved them. And I bonded with many friends who had no pretensions of being Irish about that. And it was just a cool thing. And I was a literary nerd, so I combined those things into reading James Joyce and Yeats. And yeah, I developed this kind of very simplistic, very fuzzy attachment to Irishness in some vague way, which partly came about because I'm many generations back a settler in Canada, particularly on the land of the Haudenosaunee. But when my family does identify itself with European identity on both sides, it's Irish. And that, was cool to me, as I think it is for many other people. I think a lot of white people in North America, out of a combination of things that are very understandable and things that are very problematic, want some sense of national, ethnic, cultural identity that isn't Canadian or American, or isn't white, or a lot of people and radicals have kind of extra, more explicit reasons for doing this. There's sort of a line that a way out of whiteness or of undermining whiteness is by ceasing to identify as white and instead identifying with a European nation. And I have had sympathies for that in the past, and I really don't anymore. It feels very much like I'll just re-articulate myself in this other way, and that will, wipe my hands of this whole white supremacy game. So because the main source of Irish history I was getting was from the footnotes on James Joyce books or on Yeats's poetry. So I had like a decent understanding of like the late 19th century up to like the Easter Rising. And then because I was so enthusiastic about Ireland, I did kind of a very classic post-high school backpacking trip, and I went to Ireland, and I was so aggressively immediately confronted with the fact that I had no idea what was going on, because my knowledge of Irish history stopped in about 1920 at best. I made some reference to having, family heritage in the North, and somebody was like, "Oh, what's your last name? Paisley?" And I was like, "No." And they were like, "You don't know who Ian Paisley is, do you?" "No." And they're like, That's an important guy to know who that is." And I told somebody else, "Oh, my family's from Fermanagh." And he was like, "It's Fermanagh. You don't know how to pronounce these things." And I also went on a long walk through North Belfast and ended up in some pretty hard loyalist areas where I was seeing, giant murals of men with guns and balaclavas saying, "Ready for peace, prepared for war." And just like the teenager graffiti is calling people Fenians. And I was just very aware of not being in a context I didn't understand, and that being really uncomfortable, but also very fascinating. The little bits I did understand of like being at the GPO in Dublin and like seeing the bullet holes, that was like really impactful for me. Anyway, so when I came back to Canada, I sort of undertook what ended up being a like many, many year course of study to try and get myself acquainted. And pretty quickly within that, for various reasons, the sort of genealogical, my family heritage angle ceased feeling very relevant. Because among other things, while my family identifies itself as Irish, and I think it's interesting that they do, our most recent history of immigration from across the Atlantic is England, is English people coming from England. And there's clearly, choices being made there about how to identify. And those choices are interesting, but they sort of undercut any personal importance to my lineage. I also just think, once you get into genealogy, you realize you're as much a your dad's last name as your mom's last name, and as much your grandma's last name as your grandfather's last name, and whatever. Genealogy is not politically interesting, I don't think. A little bit of knowing where you're situated is important, but the wider social context is way more important than blood lineage. And then, in terms of undertaking that study, I think people would often ask me why I was doing it. Is it because you're Irish is sort of the natural thing? And I would increasingly say, not really, basically, because I think even by the standards of Irish Canadians, I have a pretty weak claim to Irish identity. But I do find it fascinating. Like, I think it's really important in the revolutionary communist or anti-capitalist tradition. It's very important because, when Marx and Engels and people of that era are studying colonialism, Ireland is the reference point because it's Britain's first colony. It's a very active colonial situation at the time. And so because of the kind of genealogy of the Marxist left, you refer back to Ireland kind of constantly. I also think it's very interesting in terms of being in North America and race being so tightly tied to pigmentation. Ireland helps see the social constructed nature of race and the way that, there's nothing biological about it. It's a thing we say, but it's just a way of studying that in really practical terms. The way people who, like you're saying about Ralston and McVeigh, like even constructing which particular person is Catholic or nationalist or Protestant unionist is muddy and socially determined, and often has much to do about like where you can or choose to get jobs or live or all these other things. I'll also say that as much as I think studying Ireland can be particularly valuable, just undertaking a particular study of a context and just going deep at it is really useful for radicals and revolutionaries. I think it just becomes very rich. And even if it's not directly applicable, because nothing is going to be directly applicable in history, just you see the resonances and you can see patterns, and it becomes a new way of thinking through the problems you're experiencing or the issues you're trying to tackle in your day-to-day struggles. So really, I strongly encourage people to dive into something. I also think that people want to study Ireland for the kind of effective reasons that we were talking about, the kind of moves to innocence reasons, which, as I understand, that comes from the article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it's about ways that settlers position ourselves as not being really responsible because we're working class settlers or we're Irish settlers and the Irish were refugees. And there's kind of these two big political cudgels that get used at a social level to exempt white people from the crimes of white supremacy and colonization, which are like the Irish were slaves too, and the Irish were refugees. And that, I was just hearing someone the other day talk about how this continent was colonized by refugees. And that is really incorrect analysis, in my opinion. Obviously, there are people who became colonizers here, became settlers here, who were fleeing persecution. But I think that's similarly a kind of like get a jail free, get off the hook kind of maneuver.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we can see that in probably its most grotesque form at this current moment in even discussions of like Zionism and because obviously they're very much so a project of people that were fleeing real persecution. And yet, we can't allow that to be the thing that allows, endless, acts of ethnic cleansing and genocide and removal. And I think same thing in the North American context of like, even in instances where the settlers might have been fleeing some very serious persecution, of which there were instances, but it's often, I think, kind of, you all have published Sakai's work. He does a good job of breaking down some of those dynamics, but nonetheless, like you still have to deal with, okay, but what, how did we relate to people when we got here? How do we relate to Indigenous people, Black people, et cetera, right? And so, yeah, and I think, a big part of this book is this concise history of the Irish struggle for independence and liberation from British colonialism. There are aspects of that I'm not going to get into too deep because we can cite the Ralston and McVeigh interview and folks can go there for more on it because one of the things that I will say as a plug for that book and related, it also comes across in this one, and we'll get into a couple of the dynamics so that we can talk about a couple of them. But, Ireland is a very interesting case. People right now talk about Palestine as a kind of, workshop or experimentation site for all of these different forms of exclusion, removal, incorporation, and so on and so forth. And Ireland, very much for Britain, from a very early, perhaps the first, but one of the first for sure, places where they started playing with all of these different forms of plantations and settlements and forms of forced labor and ethnic cleansing and all of basically everything that we can think of and associate with colonialism. There were instances where in Irish history, those were tried for at least a period of time as a management strategy or a colonial strategy. But one of the interesting connections in this book that here, because it's written in 89, there's this connection with apartheid South Africa. And I think about this, obviously, we could, right now folks are talking about apartheid also in the Palestinian context, of course. And obviously, each of these situations does have its own particularities. Sometimes this is much more explicitly a racist or a racial system or a ethnic system, but there was an apartheid style system specifically in Northern Ireland. So can you talk a little bit about that in this book and how it kind of relates those two, South Africa, I guess, and Ireland?
In Spirit of Freedom, Attack International uses apartheid as a comparison specifically for the penal laws, the 1600s and 1700s period where there was a round of conquest and some really draconian and explicitly anti-Catholic, and to some extent also anti-dissenter laws were passed. Maybe I should just explain that because of the Troubles, we're used to talking about Catholics and Protestants, but in earlier centuries, there was a tripartite distinction between Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter. Protestant in that context means Church of England, Anglican, that's what we call it in Canada, I think. And so dissenters were to some extent also targeted by these laws, but primarily they were focused on Catholics.
So dissenters then were people who were Protestant but not part of the Church of England, essentially?
Yeah, primarily Presbyterians.
Okay.
So some of the penal laws would be like property sanctions on anyone converting to Catholicism, limitations on how much land a Catholic could own. A Catholic couldn't own a horse more than a certain value. There were things about education and religious practices. And all of those laws were functionally gone by like the 1830s. So I think for me, comparing the 17th and 18th centuries to South African and Israeli apartheid, because I'm completely comfortable with that comparison. So 20th century apartheid systems, or 21st century as well, apartheid systems, it's too long of a gap to me a little bit. There are plenty of examples in other contexts and other centuries of, race-based laws or ethnicity or religious-based laws of who could hold certain offices. And I think it lends itself to understanding the situation in the North in the 20th century as one of apartheid. And I also don't think that comparison is great. I think something more like segregation, like the way racial domination and separation is maintained in the US in the 20th century between Black and white people, and often maybe particularly in the non-Jim Crow states and non-Jim Crow periods where you have, things like redlining or things.
Gerrymandering, I think, is a good example as well.
Yeah, gerrymandering that is very much still happening. So these laws that aren't explicitly racialized or targeted at ethnic groups, but are very clearly being used that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing that I found interesting within it is just knowing that at the time in 89, that the appeal to apartheid would be, it's a point of reference, right? Because the South African struggle at that point is right at the tip. It's just about to sort of move into truth and reconciliation and all of that. For whatever people think about that, that's a whole separate discussion. But yeah, I mean, it obviously was in many ways the cause of that time. So it makes sense also, I think, as a reference point within this book that way.
For sure.
Even if, as you say, it doesn't really work that well as a kind of analogy. So there's a chapter called 1969, The Dam Breaks. I think this is one of the things that the book really does a great job of, is kind of looking at the kind of, the 60s into 89, into the sort of 20 or so year period. And so could you just talk a little bit about kind of some of the history of what's going on in that period in Irish history, why it's such a momentous or a period where there's kind of, changes in some of these dynamics, and, kind of some of the important developments that would follow that in the next, decade or so?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so most of the time when people talk about the Troubles, they would date it to 68 to 98, or give or take a few years here and there. Some people really object to the term Troubles. They think it minimizes it. To me, it is a very classically Irish thing of minimizing the own horrors that you are experiencing. Irish people absolutely use the term Troubles to refer to it, so I feel comfortable using it. But that is a political point people make. People talk about it as the war, which is fair enough. It was a war. So Ireland has its own particular position in the kind of global 68, which is, I'm perennially shocked about just how many things were going on in this very short period of time, either literally 1968, or if we take it a little more broadly, kind of 65 to 70. And particularly has a bunch of echoes to the Quiet Revolution in Quebec in terms of how it starts and the way that led into militant Quebec nationalism. People might know for the FLQ, all the resistance to Vietnam War that was happening in various ways in various places, the U.S. war on Vietnam, I should say, the Cultural Revolution in China, May 68, et cetera, et cetera. Northern Ireland as a statelet, what Republicans will call the Six Counties or the north of Ireland. So Ireland is partitioned in 1920 at the end of a war for independence, what is called Anglo-Irish War, or the War for Independence, or the Tan War. And it splits off 6 of the 9 counties of the province of Ulster from the rest, and the 26 counties in the south become the Irish Free State, and then later on, what's called today, its official name is the Republic of Ireland. In the north, those 6 counties were specifically chosen because they gave a unionist supermajority, a Protestant unionist committed to the British Empire supermajority. And so the 6 counties are run as just completely a unionist state. People call it the Orange State, after the Orange Order, which is a Protestant supremacist organization. In the 60s, after 40 years of the Orange State, there's an economic crisis, and there's an attempt to deal with it by bringing in a technocratic reformer who's staunchly unionist, unimpeachably a good unionist boy, but he's more interested in reform than preserving this kind of static Orange State. He starts introducing these reforms. He does something like meeting the Irish Taoiseach, which is the prime minister of the Free State, and that is seen as unacceptable to loyalists, or to a certain section of committed loyalists. And Reverend Ian Paisley, who's a Presbyterian minister, and I think fair to say acting as a fascist, at least for most of his political career, certainly far right, incredibly anti-Catholic on, racial bigotry lines, and also religiously, one of those Protestants who views Catholicism as the Antichrist or the Pope as the Antichrist. He starts agitating very intensively for the need to preserve Protestant ascendancy, Protestant domination of the state, and objecting to these reforms. He gets a certain group of loyalists, primarily working class Protestants, so agitated that they start a small guerrilla organization called the UVF, which persists to today in various forms, and they kill several random Catholics as their sense of resisting the takeover that they have been taught through generations to fear. At the same time, there's a developing civil rights movement, very much modeled on the civil rights movement in the US, seeking primarily one man, one vote. So they had a system basically where homeowners could vote and landlords who owned multiple houses could vote multiple times, and public councils, which were gerrymandered and always had a Protestant majority, could ensure the allocation of public housing such that more votes, because houses are votes, go to Protestant unionists. So civil rights aimed at various reforms like establishing one man, one vote, as they always called it. Obviously, one person, one vote is what they were meaning. This is also resisted by working class loyalism. As soon as there is a push for reform from below, O'Neill backs off intensely and is like, oh, this has gone too far. It's seen as the state is descending into chaos. The Catholics are getting organized. In particular, in October of 1968, a very small civil rights demo in Derry gets viciously beaten by police batons, and it's captured on television and broadcast in the South and also elsewhere. And as in many other moments, that kind of visceral seeing the violence really marked a change in people's perception of the North as not just a quiet, sleepy, remote part of an island, but like a vicious, repressive state that needed to be reformed at best. In 1969, the civil rights demonstrations are getting attacked just by loyalist gangs, like not police or off-duty cops, and on-duty cops are just letting it happen. This leads to nationalist areas in Derry getting barricaded, and throughout early 1969, increasing clashes, which culminates in the summer of 1969. There are 3 days of riots in the Bogside, which is a working class nationalist area of Derry, where they end up fully barricading the neighborhood and saying the police are not allowed in our neighborhood. That's called Free Derry and lasts for 3 years and is still commemorated to this day. And nationalists in Belfast also riot to try to bring, like, literally ease the pressure on Derry by calling cops back. This leads to the British Army being called in to relieve them, which is initially seen as protecting the Catholic population from the bigoted police force, but almost immediately becomes now the British Army are directly repressing and attacking the nationalist community. There is a split in the Republican movement, which had been very, very small up to that point, between the old guard, who had come increasingly to be skeptical of militarism for reasons that are interesting but maybe not germane, and younger people who were just kind of, we are under attack, we need to defend our communities right now, we need arms. And that became their provisional movement, the provisional IRA and provisional Sinn Féin. Right at the start of 1970. In 1971, you have internment without trial, where nationalists are just rounded up and thrown into these hastily constructed kind of military barracks, which acts as a very great escalation in terms of the violence experienced in the nationalist community. And it also brings together a whole bunch of young nationalist men, very young, like boys, often like 15, 16-year-olds. Like, I was just reading someone's memoir, and it hadn't really hit home to me that most of them were teenagers, like literally teenagers, not even in their early 20s. And people are learning history, learning about the Republican movement, learning the Irish language, learning how to make bombs in certain cases. And as those people are released, it ends up being kind of, this has happened over and over again in Irish history and also other places, that prisons end up being these kind of like these universities for the resistance. And kind of the key turning point in many ways is Bloody Sunday. There's a civil rights demo against internment in Derry, where the British Special Forces open fire on a completely unarmed crowd. These British forces kill 14 people, injure 26. And from that point on, that's sort of the hinge point between a civil rights movement that had been faltering due to the escalating violence and the rise of a very militarized struggle. So recruits pour into the provisional IRA, and from that point, the struggle is less between more of an activist, civil rights inspired, often nonviolence inspired, drawing on the civil rights movement in the US, to very like, you are either in an armed organization or you are supporting an armed organization. And that is true of essentially all working class people in the North. Some of them are supporting loyalist organizations, some of them are supporting Republican organizations. And that continues on in various ways throughout the 70s and 80s before the peace process really gets started and brings us into a new phase of things.
Yeah, right on. You know, the only other maybe historical point that you could bridge a little bit there is like, so I know the hunger strikes are really important. That happens in like 81, right? So it's a little over a decade out, but like, talk a little bit maybe about what that aspect of the struggle or movement means, what it draws upon. And I think in the book, it kind of talks about how it switches certain things from kind of, you know, armed to mass. You know, I can't remember exactly, but it was an interesting aspect of it.
Absolutely. For me, the Republican prison struggle from 1976 to 1981 is some of the most interesting period. Internment had been bringing people to this place called Long Kesh, which is essentially a big open field where they had laid down some barbed wire fences into different cages, as they were called by the Republican prisoners. And you'd have kind of a big Nielsen hut, which is like a kind of a military building, like a just quick deploy military building. And people were bunked there, and they were largely managing their own affairs within the cage. They had their own structures. Only the commanding officer would engage with the guards at the gate, like the prison guards, and people were managing their own activities and responsible for their own areas. And this also would happen for people convicted of certain scheduled offenses, or they would have special category status. Basically, if you were convicted of a a quote-unquote crime for your participation in the struggle, you would be sent to these cages rather than an ordinary prison. Part of the British state's attempt to deal with this situation is modeled on things that the US were trying to do in the war against Vietnam. There's a process there called Vietnamization, and in the North it gets called Ulsterization. So it's sort of three related processes of Ulsterization, normalization, and criminalization. The idea being that we want more cops from the North to be doing security operations and fewer British Army personnel. We want as much as possible to restore a sense of normality, to get an acceptable level of violence. That's specifically where that phrase comes from. And the criminalization track is to do away with the special category status. And so they build this modern prison right next to the cages of Long Kesh called the H blocks by Republicans, called Maze Prison by the British. And Republicans will also just continue to call that Long Kesh. From March 1st, 1976, if you're convicted of a scheduled offense, rather than getting special category status and going into the cages, you go into these prisons and you're treated like an ordinary prisoner. And Kieran Nugent, the first Republican who's sent there, consciously or unconsciously drawing on an old tradition of Republican struggle that refuses criminalization, refused to wear a prison uniform. This is a struggle that had existed during the earlier war, during the War for Independence, but he refused to wear the uniform, said, "You'll have to nail it to my back," and was thrown into a cell naked and wrapped himself in a blanket. And as more and more people came in and started doing the same thing, this developed into a mass protest known as the blanket protest, where people were kept in their cells and they were considered on punishment. So they had a pad on the floor rather than a bed. They had no reading materials except for a Bible. They're in these bare cells with nothing basically but towels and food slopped into them. And this goes on for a couple years until the next stage of escalation is chosen, which is called the no wash protest or the dirty protest, where in objection to prisoners getting beaten by guards by screws when they're slopping out because they have chamber pots rather than toilets, they just refuse to slop out. They just throw their chamber pots into the hall, basically. And then when the screws no longer open the doors to let them slop out, they start spreading their feces on the wall of their cells as both an escalation and a symbolic protest at the horrid conditions they're being held in, and also a practical effort because apparently it smells less bad if you spread it out. I've seen people present it two different ways. This continues on for another 2 years. So we're talking about people who, go into prison at 17, 18, 19 years old, and they are living naked in a cell for years. Often people were two to a cell, so they would have minor direct socialization, and then they had really inspiring and beautiful forms of collective communication, collective education throughout the wing, where they would teach Irish to each other by shouting it out through the door. They would tell each other the plots of books and movies they remembered in order to have, entertainment. They would throw birthday parties for each other. They would also smuggle in news and read out the news of the day. They would come to political decisions together, consulting about what to do, and they would maintain their structures in terms of who was the officer commanding the OC of the wing and the whole IRA structure. I should say it was not just IRA prisoners who were doing this. There were also prisoners from the Irish National Liberation Army, which was also a Republican armed struggle group that was affiliated with the Irish Republican Socialist Party. They were much more of a Marxist-Leninist group. Their history is interesting, but they are, in terms of numbers, like a much smaller organization. In 1980, they escalate this into a hunger strike where a few prisoners all go on hunger strike together. A difficult situation is created where one of the prisoners is about to die, and the OC, who is also on hunger strike, is promised that a deal is coming. The British are about to come with a deal that should help them, and the OC orders that the prisoner who's about to die and who is unconscious be fed, and that ends the hunger strike, and the deal ends up being nothing worthwhile. It doesn't satisfy the demands of the prisoners, which were Specifically, there were 5 demands around being able to wear their own clothes, having access to regular letters and parcels and communication with the outside, the right to refuse prison work, free association amongst each other, and the right to organize their own educational and recreational pursuits, and the restoration of all the remission, like the time that you'd normally get off your sentence for good behavior that had been lost due to the protest. Those were the 5 demands. A few months later, they remodel the structure of the hunger strike, and this is the much more famous hunger strike. Bobby Sands, who was the OC of the wing, is the first hunger striker. He begins on March 1st, 1981, which is the 5th anniversary of the revocation of special category status, and he will die in May after 66 days on hunger strike. Every 2 weeks, a new prisoner would join the strike with a very conscious and calculated plan that they would have this rolling series of deaths, which would be both an organizational boon for people on the outside feeling motivated by this horror that's unfolding, and also keep up the pressure on Thatcher's government. Eventually, 10 men die on this hunger strike, and it ends not with a victory, but with the families of the prisoners getting convinced to intervene once they fall unconscious in order that they be fed. And eventually the hunger strike is called off because essentially it has shown it's not going to work, both because the British are not going to give in, and then the families of the men, because they have decided the British are not going to give in, have decided that they don't want their sons to die for what they see as no longer any purpose, and the hunger strike ends. That said, the demands are all essentially achieved in the coming years. Into the 80s and 90s, Republicans are essentially living in special category status under other names. They have their own wings, they organize their own classes, they keep their own space clean, but don't do other prison work. And I think, broadly speaking, the prison struggle does achieve what it set out to achieve with enormous cost. Now, important for the struggle on the outside is that this creates a huge mass mobilization, both locally in the 6 counties, but also throughout Ireland and also throughout the world. I believe it's either in Cairo or Tehran, and it's brutal that I'm mixing those two up. The street that British embassy is renamed Bobby Sands Street, so that they have to put on all their mail and correspondence that you send it to Bobby Sands Street. There are solidarity was all around the world. And they also make use of electoralism by running first Bobby Sands and then other prisoners who are on hunger strike in electoral campaigns. Obviously, they'll never sit if they're elected, both because they're prisoners and because they're abstentionist Republicans. But, Bobby Sands got more votes than Margaret Thatcher ever did because of how parliamentary systems work, and because Thatcher's a monster and Bobby Sands is a hero, maybe. And this process of mobilization, where people who were coming into a struggle around the rights of Republican prisoners weren't necessarily the sorts of people who would have been participating in the Republican movement before. It allowed kind of a new way in for people who were maybe uncomfortable to some extent with the armed campaign. And it really grows Sinn Féin as a political organization. And that's really a double-edged sword. It represents, on some level, a return of mass politics and kind of greater role for politics over militarism, which is good to me. That seems like a clear good. And Spirit of Freedom, like Attack International in their text, really praised that. They were sort of like, this represented a really positive change. I think from the benefit of a little further down the road, it looks like the growth of Sinn Féin, which becomes Sinn Féin the political party, which becomes Sinn Féin the ruling party, which is administering austerity and compromising a lot of their political values up to the present day. Their long-stated political values up, just in the past month, rather shockingly, Sinn Féin reversed their stance on kicking out the Israeli ambassador. And then they reversed that stance again to end up supporting the expulsion of the ambassador. after there was so much outcry from their base. But that's just a particular example of kind of the road that Sinn Féin goes down. And over the process of the peace process, which is from the late 80s into the late 90s and then into the 2000s, the war basically ends in 1997. The peace process kind of continues until 2007. The end of the war is a good thing insofar as war is terrible. And the effects of the war were overwhelmingly falling on working class communities and nationalist communities in particular. And I think there's a desire to frame it as, oh, the mistake was just not continuing the war. I'm much more sympathetic to the position that sees the agreement that was achieved as not good. The Good Friday Agreement is deeply flawed, deeply problematic. It doesn't offer a path for liberation for the Irish working class, but continuing the war also doesn't make sense. And the IRA had fought the British Army to a standstill, a stalemate, I should say, but the British Army had also fought the IRA to a stalemate, and there was not much more to be gained, in my opinion, and also in the opinion of some of the people who were in the IRA in the 90s, looking at this and wanting to see a new way forward for the Republican movement.
Yeah, right on. Thank you for that history. And I did look it up as you were talking about it. So it was in Tehran, and it's, makes sense actually, because the Iranian Revolution was in 1979. And actually it says that in 81, which was when Bobby Sands died on hunger strike, that Iran sent official representation to his funeral and presented Mrs. Sands with a plaque from the people of Iran. So, whatever people's analysis of Iran and, the revolution and the post-revolutionary government and all of that, certainly at that time, there was, an anti-colonial solidaristic thing going on between those two sites. And there's an interesting, it's actually on the Bobby Sands Trust website. There is a little reflection written by a former Iranian student at that time about the night we named Bobby Sands Street. So I'll make a note of that. We can drop that in the show notes too, if people want to check that out. But yeah, so interesting connection there for sure. But does show, I think, in addition to Sands winning his election, which of course he would never actually sit in Parliament, it's a good example of how broad this was. I mean, Angela Davis, for instance, was also there was a lot of connection between her and her former political prison status with Bobby Sands and some of the hunger strikers. And it was a huge kind of international touchstone for people, cause celeb, I guess, or whatever you would call it. But it was a big deal. So Chapter 7, so we get in here to what's called the Republican movement, is what this chapter is called. Often in our minds, if we don't delve more deeply into this history, if we don't study it, we might understand this just through what folks call the IRA. That's like the kind of main term that, and rightfully so. I mean, kind of the largest aspect, or what we now call Sinn Féin, which we just talked a little bit about their sort of recent history, which is, now the body of the Republican movement that has transitioned into formal parliamentary politics and, is ostensibly still the Republican, which would mean the sort of anti-colonial or the idea of one Ireland, not partitioned and so on. But, it has definitely not been able to produce that in a meaningful politic. And there's a lot of, like you said, critiques of some of their politics from a working class perspective as well. So talk a little bit about the dynamics of the Republican movement that this book examines, kind of both in its original form and including its new contributions. And I guess part of what I mean by this too is just to say that there are more component parts to that. There are tensions and contradictions and disagreements within the movement. And I'm just interested in, to the extent you want to talk about some of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some people will talk about the Republican movement, and they usually capitalize R and M in that. And what they mean is, i.e., the provisional Republican movement, i.e., the provisional IRA and provisional Sinn Féin, and organizations that are affiliated directly with them, kind of thing. Now, that in itself is a is a movement. It's multifaceted. There are tensions. Large political parties always have tensions and debates within them. This is the case for Sinn Féin, but then Sinn Féin also has disagreements with the IRA. It also has its own internal politics. And then, people who are operating kind of affiliated community organizations would have their own tensions and complications. But importantly, the Republican movement, as I think it's more fair to say, is much broader than the provisional movement. It's also includes the official Republican movement. It would also include the INLA and the IRSP, which we were talking about earlier. And I think very importantly, it includes ordinary Republicans. It includes whole neighborhoods of Belfast and Derry. It includes whole regions of South Armagh. Because it's a real mass movement. I think this is one of the things I find very fascinating about Irish republicanism as somebody, growing up in neoliberal Canada. Like, the things we call movements aren't movements by the standard, or they're a different quality of thing in terms of how deeply they penetrate into, the ordinary lives of ordinary people and the numbers of people they reach and involve and engage. And it also is a movement with a very long history. Like, most people would say Irish republicanism dates itself back to the 1860s with the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Certainly there's the War for Independence in 1916 or 1919, depending on when you start, up to 23 in the Civil War. And there's the whole interregnum of when portions of the Republican movement accept the Treaty Compromise, the Partition Compromise, the Free State Compromise, and go into government in the South. And there are those that maintain illegal Republican structures up to the 1960s, such that while it's greatly reduced in size and capacity, there's still a Sinn Féin and still a IRA in the North to be revitalized and joined and eventually split. But that's a mantle to be taken up, not just symbolically, but like organizationally. Within that long movement, there are a lot of kind of standard tensions, I would say, between militarism and politics. Would sort of be a broad tension, and none of these things are exclusive of one another, but the degree to which you emphasize achieving the movement's goals through armed struggle and the degree to which you emphasize the politics and the engaging people in political activity rather than treating it as a purely military issue. Kind of relatedly, but also distinctly, there's kind of a sectarianism versus politics perspective of, is it seen as the defense forces for the Catholic community in a sectarian society? And to what degree is it a political Republican movement for the liberation of the people of Ireland, or the people of the world, or the working classes of Ireland, or variations therein? And again, relatedly, what is the role of Catholicism? Is it kind of an ethnic identifier that doesn't really mean very much? Most of the people would be Catholic, not in the sense of they subscribe to the teachings of the Catholic Church, but Catholic in terms of maybe they got baptized and that's the identity that they sort of have. And relatedly to that is kind of a traditionalism versus progressivism or socialism distinction. And this is maybe the main thing you see isolating, like neither side is ever completely eclipsed, but at times the traditionalist Catholic, very conservative wing of things is much more ascendant, and at other times the socialist, revolutionary, people who want to link up with godless commies all over the world are more ascendant. And sometimes that's represented by, what do people say, a 32 county republic, or do they say a 32 county socialist republic? Also is symbolized by things like, do you wrap the Armalite rifle in a rosary, or do you wrap it in, the starry plough, the symbol of kind of Irish socialism, going back to James Connolly? And I think another dynamic related to all these things is kind of, to what degree is this about Ireland, and to what degree is this about anti-imperialism or a global struggle? To what degree is this seen as tying into Cuba, Palestine, many, many things all over the world? And we've seen some of those internationalist commitments be sold out pretty fast, I think. I think one of the strongest sticking points has been solidarity of Irish people en masse, whether they identify strongly with republicanism or not, with Palestine and being supportive of the liberation of Palestine. And then even just in this month, we've seen Sinn Féin show itself, willing to dial that down so that they can integrate more into respectable politics. But that was a thing that got them huge pushback in a way that, they've had many rounds of doing things that were previously unthinkable. And sometimes they don't get that much pushback on it, actually, because people have signed on to the kind of the peace strategy of Sinn Féin and whatever we need to do to advance the cause of Sinn Féin is what we need to do. Anyway, I think those are just kind of a few of the dynamics at play.
So let's talk a little bit about chapter 8. This is one of, another really interesting chapter in the book. This is where Attack International starts to get into some ideas for political practice from a British anti-imperialist context. As you said, this is part of where it lays out some of its critiques of various organizations or positions from that point of view. So it begins, quote, "The history of Ireland is one of imperialist occupation by the British state. That occupation must be ended. There's no question about that. But it's no good fighting for British withdrawal out of sympathy is put in quotes, for the Irish, or trying to patronize Ireland in the same way liberals patronize the Third World. In fact, getting the troops out isn't a moral issue at all. It is not an issue of being, quote unquote, nice to a suffering people or trying to turn Ireland into another Nicaragua. If we look at why the British state is in Ireland, then it becomes clear that fighting for immediate British withdrawal from Ireland is in our interests too," end quote. So I'd love if you could lay out a bit of the argument that they're making here. It reminded me a little bit. We had a recent conversation with Max Isle where we were talking about the Palestinian struggle currently. And, he kind of talked about it in similar ways of saying, like, it's not adequate to just sort of be in solidarity or to look at Palestinians as a charity case, right? This is a part of the world that we want to build, right? That's the way that we have to understand it. So, and also connecting the liberation of Palestinian people with our own liberation as well. So just talk a little bit about the argument Attack International lays out here in terms of why British people should see the end of occupation of the 6 counties as in their interest as well. I think that's important because also there's always working class arguments that are made to the contrary of that in these sort of colonial settings of like, we shouldn't worry about that. We benefit from imperialism, basically,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Attack International makes some really specific ties that, interestingly, I think are very true about U.S. and Canadian, among others, support for Israel, is that the 6 counties were very clearly, unambiguously a laboratory for repressive techniques, whether that be, anti-terrorist, quote unquote, laws, quote unquote terrorist, not quote unquote laws. They were definitely laws, or, new technologies, new types of tear gas, or, even just training riot police. Like literally, once you get to a certain level in the British police force, you have to go to Ireland to learn that part of things so that you can bring it home and use in whatever part of Great Britain you're in. So just on that level, that this is a place where the technologies of repression that the working class faces and will increasingly face as we move towards liberation, that's where those techniques are being perfected, developed, literally technologically developed, or in terms of training, going back and forth. And also, it's a place where those resources are being challenged from the oppressed, with fewer technologies finding their own techniques against them. And it's a place where those techniques could lose en masse. Both the 6 counties in the British context of the 70s and 80s, and I think the Israeli state now, there's a tremendous commitment of resources and troops to making this racist colonial state exist. And if those resources can be negated by a successful liberation struggle, that only benefits all the people who are going to face the states that have invested those resources. I think much more specifically about Ireland, they make the point in this chapter, which I very much agree with, that Ireland has not been for a long time a colony in the sense of a source of wealth for Britain. And by the time the war begins, it's clearly an economic drain. Britain is just pouring money into the six counties, both for repressive forces, but also trying to keep the economy afloat, like subsidizing industries or subsidizing companies to start factories. The DeLorean from Back to the Future, that was the whole project where they put the factory in the north so that it could bring jobs and stabilize and normalize the economy. So what is the investment? There's another kind of argument that I think is more correct, but Attack International also dismisses with some righteousness, I think, that sort of the fear is, okay, but if a socialist Irish Republican movement wins, because the official policy of the Republican movement in the 70s and 80s was, we are socialists and we want a revolution north and south. We want a united Ireland. We don't want to just absorb the six counties into the southern state. We need to remake society and the state as one new country along socialist principles. So the idea of Britain having, people will say like a new Cuba just off its shores, this is a major fear, or a country that is more aligned with actually existing socialist countries, or is itself an actually existing socialist country. These are legitimate security concerns. Legitimate in the sense of, I understand why they would be concerned about it. They're also kind of, Attack International is kind of dismissive of this position and ends up saying the British want out of the North. They just can't find a way to get out with stability. They can't find sort of legitimate brokers to not have the danger of, even if it's not a socialist island, the island next door to you descending into chaos or civil war would pose security ramifications for Great Britain. And one can see, rather cynically, but I think somewhat validly, the peace process as an attempt to sort of create those responsible power brokers who can manage the transition to United Ireland in a way that doesn't challenge the global capitalist system, doesn't threaten the security of Great Britain or other countries. And even also as part of the peace process, the US in particular was getting more involved politically. It was a way for Clinton to score some points with, the huge Irish American demographic, but also in neoliberal capitalism, borders are a problem for capital too when they're not functioning as purely against people, which, that border was functioning to some extent to disrupt economic integration and success. And, a united Ireland that could be a place for direct foreign investment as it had become in the South. Like the Celtic Tiger is the story of like a bunch of US companies pouring a bunch of money into the South, and that raised the standard of living for a lot of people in the South, and is actually one of the reasons why the peace process came about, because if the South is not an incredibly poor region, if it's modern and there are jobs and it's not completely dominated by the Catholic hierarchy, it's much more appealing for people in the North who are benefiting from the NHS and different parts of British law that are privileges. And I don't necessarily mean that negatively. There are privileges that are a problem because not everyone has them, and there are privileges that are a problem because nobody should have them. Healthcare is definitely one of those. Everybody should have their privileges. And more broadly, I think we live in a historical era where the form of global capitalist imperialism that has existed for the past couple centuries is falling apart, and it's less and less able to expand. I don't think that deterministically means that we're headed towards socialism. I think it means we're headed to something different, and it's unclear what that's going to be, but the pattern has been reduced benefits for the working class and the imperial core, like real wages falling for decades and decades now, increasingly managing imperialism through direct war. Not that there always wasn't war, but, the US empire increasingly has a giant army and not much to throw around economically because there is an increasingly integrated transnational capitalist class that has feet in China and in the EU and in the United States. And as that kind of falls apart, you have these national chauvinist movements rising up to sort of, I think maybe most sympathetically, but maybe it's a bit oversimplified, but there's a kind of like defense of the lost privilege of living in the imperial core. And I think those of us who are the oppressed, the working class, whatever, those of us who are fighting for liberation in the global north, we can make a choice to bind ourselves to imperialism and watch the numbers of people who are benefiting from that privilege shrink and shrink and shrink and just fight to stay in that increasingly small group. Or we can link up and identify ourselves with the people who are confronting that system and set about trying to build something new in its wake rather than just watching it fall and hoping to prolong the time before that fall hits us. And I will maybe push back slightly on the Attack International thing of sort of like, it's not a moral issue, it's not about sympathy, where I think this ties into the profitability thing where, like, you know, I saw something where I think it was in New York where people had like a billboard or something that said, you know, sorry about the potholes, your tax dollars are going to kill Gazan children. And I have no objection to that. Like that, I think that's a very effective form of propaganda. But it sort of hints at that kind of like profitability thing, which I think is maybe closer to the sort of anti-interventionist, or like obviously the US shouldn't be intervening, but like the isolationist sort of like, why are we worried about all these people elsewhere when we should be only caring about Americans or whatever? Or like, I think if somebody is looking at a situation of colonialism and horror and being like, well, what's in it for me for this to stop? You know, something's wrong. I think there's space for morals and sympathy and fighting the good fight, even if it doesn't benefit you personally. And I think Attack International gets into this other places too, where I actually think it's a bit of a tension that runs through the text. It comes up different ways in different places. And because of how they write, always really strong one way or really strong the other way, of kind of like the balance between, you know, kind of unite and fight reductionism of like the working classes everywhere's interests are exactly the same. And like all these things about racism and colonialism are just artificial divisions put in by the ruling class. And there's some truth to that, but these, as we see in Ireland, as we see in Palestine, as we see everywhere, you know, these sort of artificial divisions, quote unquote, become very real, tangible economic class differences. And there's only so much that can be just kind of like, their struggle is our struggle. We're all in this together. Like there has to be some space for, I'm willing to betray the benefits I receive, you know, for being in the global worker elite or whatever, the labor aristocracy or the global north. I'm willing to compromise or fight against those things because of how they come about.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm one of those people. I mean, obviously we do a lot of discussion of materialism on here, you know, and like of trying to make, you know, those materialist arguments for certain things. And, you know, with that in the Marxist tradition, there is often a sort of critique of folks just addressing things for moral reasons. And I do think that you can get yourself in a lot of knots, or moral arguments or moralistic arguments can be dangerous in certain contexts and can, you know, depending on what form they take and all of that. But I do agree with you, especially in a, yeah, I mean, we're both white guys in North America. Like, if we strictly went with like what is in our best interests, you know, from a financial stance, you know, like unless we think that there's going to be a global revolution and we think that this global revolution in our lifetimes is going to give us some sort of great financial or material benefits, then at some point we're making some kind of moral argument about how are we going to situate ourselves in solidarity with people that are oppressed by our countries, of which we do draw certain benefits or privileges, like you said, that are bad because, you know, not everybody can have them, you know. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you that you have to kind of I think we need moral and materialist arguments in our struggles, and I think we shouldn't just turn people away either because they come for some moral reason, because a lot of times that is what draws people in first, is kind of like a moral connection, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think with a lot of things, it's like, I don't believe in the, like, you know, the answer is always in the middle, certainly, but I think often the truth is a balance between two things that are contradictory. Like, this is part of what dialectics means to me, is that just because two things are contradictory doesn't mean they're not both true, you know? Like, I think it's just a balance, because like both of those things are going to be there.
Yeah, and then their intention, and at different times, certain things, you know, become, I guess, more dominant in how we can think about it, you know. But so continuing on, there are criticisms. We've talked about this of various British left-wing or anti-imperialist organizations in the concluding chapters. Obviously, some of this is just kind of like, you know, interesting as a historical artifact, and to look at that, you know, within its context. I was interested, as you looked at it, if there were things in that section that you think are interesting today, more so not as like the critiques of individual orgs, because some of them are around, some of them are not. They can change over time, whatever, but more just in terms of kind of how they're thinking about some of the factions and tensions and tendencies within the British left. Yeah, and I'm just curious about that today. But yeah, I just was interested in any aspects of that section you found, you know, interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a running thing with Attack International is kind of true to their sort of like insurrectionary communist or sort of like agitational working class perspective of sort of like, you're into the class or you're into the oppressed, and organizations come and go, but they're judged by their relationship to the class and class politics, rather than, and very critical of people who, or groups who they see as falling into kind of, we'll build the organization and then the organization at some point will achieve salvation for the class. And so along that road, you just end up having endless compromises of decent class principles in the interest of building the party. And that can go very different ways. I think some of the kind of like moderations of Sinn Féin's socialist politics or anti-imperialist politics, as they become more of a normal parliamentary party, is one of those, but also where you have just people who are at the demo and they're waving the flag, but the flag is actually their organization's flag, and the main thing they're there for is to get you to join their organization. And I strongly believe that organizations are very necessary, and I'm not at all anti-organizationalist, but I agree with that kind of anti-organizational critique to an extent, again, that, you know, it's important to be wary of. An organization will sometimes kind of inevitably, seemingly put its own growth, its own interests above the interests of the principles it's ostensibly built to uphold and defend. They're also calling out, or not even necessarily calling out, just pointing out how radical words become conservative politics. And this happens over and over and over again. And it's never a dynamic that we're going to be rid of. But I think this is part of why studying history is important. You know, history is the study of change over time, and people and groups change over time over and over and over again, and often in more conservative directions, although not exclusively. And just being sensitive to and wary to those changes without getting kind of attached to the cult of personality around a person, or the sort of like warm feelings you have towards an organization or a set of symbols, and just sort of being like, okay, but what does this org mean now? What are they actually doing? What are they about? And, you know, actions always meaning more than words. They talk a lot about the ways that electoralism in mainstream parties, like specifically in the UK or in Great Britain, there's much more of a tradition of the hard left having a presence in the Labour Party. I mean, there is a Labour Party, which doesn't exist in the US, and I think the NDP in Canada has some similarities, but just being skeptical of social democracy and being very skeptical of the idea that you can sort of be the radical wing of social democracy that pulls it to something better, and pointing out how often that leads, in fact, to the softening of people's revolutionary politics or people's anti-imperialist politics. They also call out kind of the opposed positions of, we would support the IRA no matter what, doesn't matter who's in it, as long as they're killing British soldiers until there is a united Ireland, we are for them. And that kind of just cheerleading, just like picking your team and being like, it's not, no, people wouldn't say this, but it's not about the politics. It's just about this very narrow, which team are you on? And it just doesn't work. We need to, for our politics to be liberatory, they need to be politics. And then that means there needs to be space for, conditional support or challenging critical support or all those sorts of things. And then at the other extreme, the sort of people did bad things on both sides. So who can say who's right? This has just been so intense in the last month I feel like I've just been seeing people. I feel like there was many years of critiques of Israel becoming much more mainstream, much more acceptable, and apartheid being more and more just an established, stateable analysis that is non-controversial among many more people. And then I think last month we saw pretty clearly that a bunch of people value Israeli life more than Palestinian life, and white supremacy runs very deep, and the sort of hegemonic ideologies we're brought up in and immersed in all the time are very hard to escape. But this maybe gets into the moralism thing a little bit of if we're not going to be pacifists, people are going to do things that are immoral. And I think there is still legitimate space for debate around the ethics of certain military tactics. And I would certainly have not that it matters one lick what I think, but if I was in any position to comment, I might have opinions about the ethics of certain military tactics that were undertaken. But I think a lot of people seem to be reacting to Palestinians as agents of violence. And that was hard to see. That's been hard to see. And even in the past few weeks, as it's become much more the traditional thing of just mass slaughter of Palestinian civilians, a lot of people seem to be coming back. And it reeks of this kind of just, I'm comfortable with being on the side of Palestinians who are being killed, but I'm not comfortable with associating myself with Palestinians who are resisting.
I think the whole idea of the quick, there's so much effort that goes into not only identifying Hamas as a terrorist organization, but also making sure that condemning them is a precondition of a right to even speak on the subject, which is just sort of, I think, really absurd when nobody ever says you have to condemn the carpet bombing of hospitals in order to speak on the subjects, or whatever else that, So, yeah, that's the history, right? Obviously this is because of the scale of what the resistance was like this time and the scale of the response. All of these things are kind of heightened. But also this is very much a pattern of whenever the Palestinians engage in any sort of action that leads to any loss of life whatsoever, the question comes up of whether you condemn them for doing so, and I think it was Too Black actually maybe wrote something out about I condemn your condemnation, and it was I think that, that's the sort talk about moralism, right? Of the idea that in order to have an analysis or to discuss or to express solidarity or state a political position, we have to come out first with a moral argument against resistance, essentially. And I don't think it greatly matters the form that resistance takes. And I think it was also Ilan Pepe, or I don't know how he pronounces it exactly, but the Israeli historian. But he said something I think was really important, which was in any anti-colonial struggle, there are moments that are going to make us quite queasy. And that's correct, right? We shouldn't feel comfortable with everything that happens, and we don't have to agree or feel like everything that happens is like morally good or ethically, like some of the things that are going to happen that way. But like, you think about how many things on the flip side, right, that have happened to Palestinians over the last month that are just atrocious, right? And so, yeah, I mean, those are the complicated aspects of anti-colonial struggle, I think, is that especially when there isn't a possible political solution outside of violence that seems to be available. So yeah, sorry, I realize that we're both off topic now, but
that's fine. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is true of the IRA too. Like, to bring it back, the IRA is, the provisional IRA as an organization that existed from 1969 to 2007 is not an organization that I would wholeheartedly stand behind, both in the sense of their general politics. I think, I have political critiques of their project. I think there are a number of absolute atrocities that the IRA committed that are wrong. I think by and large, I have a lot of respect for how they conducted the campaign. I think, as Attack International, I think by and large, they fought a pretty clear campaign, and they made mistakes and things that I think can't even be called mistakes, that are just horrible. Like, it's just a terrible thing that happened, and it was done by that organization, and there you go. But I uphold and defend the right of oppressed people to defend themselves, and also to defend themselves collectively, to defend themselves against violent structures, not just immediate physical violence. And I believe there's a place for revolutionary violence. And in some ways, I think this discussion around, like, do you or do you not condemn Hamas? Like, the actual problem is that we in the left are irrelevant to the discussion. Like, we in the Western left are largely irrelevant to the discussion of the politics of the organizations that Palestinian people rally behind or support or don't. To a very extent, we're irrelevant to the processes that are shaping those politics and that are shaping the decisions about, like, what tactics get used. Like, the only function my condemning of Hamas can serve is just to add to the chorus of people who look like me and live where I live, saying that, these people are terrorists and resistance is unjustified. The other thing I think that is true in both, the Irish context, particularly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and in general, Ireland throughout many centuries, and in Palestine, is this kind of like nationalism is bullshit position just doesn't hold water. Like, that's a major point of Attack International's text, and I think there's more a thing that comes about, I think, among anarchists than maybe among other forms of revolutionary anti-capitalists, but it does come up too among kind of like,
yeah, there's the whole Marxist line of, like, whatever, the working man does not have a country or whatever, and this, like, gets used to, yeah, I mean, none of us like nationalism. Like, ultimately, it's not what we want as our ideal, but I do think the anarchists, more than certainly like most Marxist-Leninists specifically, I guess, or Maoists, do take a position that gives them more qualms often about supporting a nationalist movement, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's an interesting dynamic of that in Canada, because, if you are any kind of radical or revolutionary or anarchist, like, you can't ignore the intensity, importance, significance of Indigenous resistance, which is very clearly done on the basis of nationhood. So I think that Canadian anarchists, unlike British anarchists or Irish anarchists would be a similar case for different reasons, but British anarchists or maybe even US anarchists, it's a little bit less tenable to just have the really simplistic anti-nationalism position. But I also think one of the ways people get around that is by sort of pretending that indigenous resistance is not nationalism.
Yeah, right on. Thank you. So you offer some thoughts in this about loyalism as a kind of corollary of sorts of settlerism or kind of working class reactionary politics in other contexts, including our own. So you also write a short section in this, and this is one of these sets of, like, I don't know what you call them, and you can tell me as part of your answer to this, but like it's basically a section where you add a note, but it's not just a footnote. It's like an extended little like 1 or 2 page explanation of something.
An inset.
An inset. There you go. And so it's called Collusion, What We've Learned Since 1989. So this talks about collusion between loyalists and the British state, which is obviously a long-term dynamic. But can you talk a little bit more about the dynamics you're examining here and what you think is politically useful here to sort of highlight?
Yeah. So maybe just some terminology to orient the discussion a little bit. And maybe people have inferred this, or maybe people already know this, but there are these paired terms, unionism and loyalism, and nationalism and republicanism. And they tend to correlate with a politics and with a class position and with a relationship to violence. So republicanism is a subset of nationalism, loyalism is a subset of unionism, but generally speaking, working class organizations or people who are more based in working class communities and willing to use violence would be grouped under the loyalism and republicanism headings rather than unionism and nationalism, or unionist and nationalist. That's more true, I would say, on the unionist loyalist side. Republicanism, I think, has some of its own political tradition and political differences, but unionism, in some extent, is the bigger category of which loyalism is a subset, but also unionism would be more associated with like politicians or unionists and people organizing armed organizations to pursue their objectives on the loyalist side, largely through terrorizing the Catholic community, killing random civilians. That would be more called loyalism. But also things like they undertook a general strike against a political agreement they didn't agree with in the 1970s, or they would be rioting or doing all kinds of different things in working class communities to pursue their understanding of their politics. All that said, as we talked about in the kind of discussing how the conflict evolved in the 60s, there's this immediate tension between the kind of like technocratic modernizing reforms of O'Neill and that being directly opposed by figures like Ian Paisley or those people who reorganized the UVF or organized a new UVF in the 60s and were trying to sabotage those efforts at reform. So that would be an example, as I see it, of the kind of autonomy of loyalism with regards to unionism. Like, obviously they are aligned, but there are dynamics of tension. And unionism is more aligned with the British state, but even, unionism and the British state would have their own sort of tensions. And some of where I'm coming at with this is that sort of three-way fight analysis of kind of like, we shouldn't just group all of our enemies together. We should recognize that there are legitimate tensions and conflicts that arise between kind of like fascist revolutionaries or people who are system oppositional, I think is the phrase that gets used, versus people who are trying to defend the system as it stands. I think another place we can see this is there are these moments where loyalism, because it's rooted, I think, arguably because it has a working class basis, which does have a fair bit in common with, the working class nationalist communities, but also just the orientation of being armed groups that are illegal and operating outside of the law or standard politics, is you get things like, there were some loyalist prisoners who went on the blanket because they shared the analysis of the Republicans that we are not criminals and we will not wear a criminal uniform and we will resist this attempt to criminalize our struggle. There were even loyalists who were on hunger strike in 1980, and their organizations ordered them to stop eventually because it was seen as collaboration with the enemy. There are kind of these moments that I think some people want to inflate and other people want to make go away. But there are these moments of kind of an emergent left-wing loyalism, which obviously is a completely confused position, but it's people trying to figure things out in a confused way and talking about maybe we should have an independent country because, the loyalists see themselves as consistently betrayed by England, but by Britain, by the UK, by the British, and at the same time defined by loyalty to them. And at the same time, breaking their laws and doing all kinds of things that are clearly disloyal to British government. So what does that loyalty mean and what is it to? Often it's loyalty to a certain set of symbols. And if the loyalty is only to symbols, it can go different ways. One example of kind of where a lot of the things we learned about collusion comes from, and I think illustrating the close ties, but also autonomy and tension, is that in 1989, the UFF, which is the armed group associated with the UDA, generally, if the groups have U in their name, they're loyalists. That's a handy little mnemonic. But the main ones are UDA, UVF, and then the UFF is affiliated with the UDA. They killed a Catholic, and they claimed, unlike often where they would just be like, we killed a Catholic, maybe this will stop the IRA. They were like, no, this guy was a senior figure in IRA intelligence. And, the Republican movement denied it. Even parts of the British state were coming out and saying, we have no evidence that this is true. And so the UDA started releasing British military intelligence that had told them that this guy was in IRA intelligence, which completely exposed that there was heavy collusion between the organizations. But also, of course, the British Army would never want it getting out there that they had been supplying intelligence. So that was, the UDA was defending itself, even though what they were doing was clearly harming the British state. And that's more of an example of kind of like two organizations that are clearly the enemy of all freedom-loving, justice-supporting people, and also the Republican movement. Not to say that there's a difference there. And that tension was very generative or informative for Republicans and for like people studying the conflict in general, because all the way through, Republicans had been screaming about collusion, had been saying like, this is happening, this is definitely happening, but lacked a lot of evidence. And we've just gotten more and more evidence of how deep that collusion ran, like the number of informers in the armed loyalist organizations. The IRA and Republican movements in general were also heavily infiltrated, but the roles of those informers was different. So otherwise, I think this kind of treating loyalism as distinct, as opposed to just sort of like, one of the names we give to unionism, which is one of the names we give to British state interests, is we can see kind of parallels playing out for us in our own context. Like I think there are parallels to the sort of like neoliberal transnational capitalism versus kind of reactionary national socialist, national chauvinist blocks, Freudian slip there, that are like increasingly a big part of geopolitics and, country national politics. I think you can also see it in things like, in the US, the splits in the Republican Party between sort of like Republicans who are like, we're Republicans because we want to like lower taxes and like cut aid, and the sort of MAGA Trumpian wing. And, treating those things as if they're all the same only hurts us by sort of giving us less information, as much as they might all be people we are fighting, recognizing the ways in which they're autonomous and distinct. I also think about instances of Indigenous resistance in Canada that I'm more proximate to, more familiar with. It's like in Six Nations, there was a land reclamation just on the border of a town called Caledonia, like white settler town, small town in 2006. And a similar thing is happening now and has been for the last few years, called 1492 Land Back Lane. People should know about and be supporting. But in 2006 in particular, there were more of these dynamics of settlers in Caledonia wanting to see greater repression and greater violence used against the land defenders, to the point where they were becoming increasingly in conflict with the police. because the police and government strategy was much more, let's pacify this, let's make this go away, let's wrap this up in the courts, let's slow this down, and the sort of like settler demand for immediate criminalization and repression, which I think often looks like, a more nuanced strategy and just a rejection of all strategy, Also in 1990, what people might know as the Oka crisis, that was based out of Conestoga and Ganawage, which are two Mohawk communities just off the island of Montreal. Around Ganawage in particular, the major form that resistance took was the blockade of a bridge onto the island of Montreal that was widely used by commuters in this huge white community that used it to commute in and out of the city, becoming increasingly agitated. There was all kinds of horrible violence and organizing, including, some of the rare uses of Molotov cocktails against police in Montreal history. That is a thing that has happened more here than some other places in North America, but it's still a rare instance. And I think both from a tactic fetishization perspective and from a being aware about what it means when settlers are coming into open, direct conflict with the police over a shared desire to repress Indigenous resistance, it's just another illustration of that dynamic that I think it's important to be sensitive to, rather than treating settlers as just sort of, an extension of the state.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And actually, it made me think of a comment that I don't think I fully fleshed out earlier of talking to about, I think you had brought up the term Ulsterization earlier on, and I think, as I think it's even referenced in the text, but there was also a policy of Vietnamization. This was something that was used in the U.S. war in Vietnam, where the idea was make it as much as possible a fight between South Vietnamese or, if you can get a hold of dissident folks within North Vietnam or whatever, make it as much as possible a fight that is internal, and the repressive apparatus as much as possible seem like an internal one, as opposed to the British troops and the British soldiers being the ones that are the key face of the repressive apparatus. And I think that that's a dynamic, obviously, we see play out in, a million different ways these days, whether it's IDF with, rainbow flags on their, jets, or whether it's Black police chiefs, sheriffs, district attorneys, etc., right? Of this idea that just by providing some representation that is Irish, that this somehow then makes it seem more legitimate or more maybe democratic, right? The forces of repression. And that's one of the, again, that's a part of these schemes come in tension too with people who are opposed to these things, right? Of people who say, no, we shouldn't have gay or trans people in the military, or no, we shouldn't have women in the military, or no, we shouldn't have, Black police chiefs or whatever else, because they're approaching it from a more fascistic or a more conservative or whatever point of view. I guess it's just another example of just understanding those different tensions and movements and different strategies, I guess, of co-optation and assimilation, that are attempted. All of them, obviously, with a shared interest of control, or in many cases, elimination or whatever. But these strategies come in contradiction with each other sometimes, where people, again, to that kind of, to use the Canadian example of the people turning against the police. We have examples of that in the United States with regard to January 6th and some of the people within the, Make America Great Again, quote unquote, movement, is that there are folks within those forces that are extremely pro-nationalist, pro-police, Blue Lives Matter flags, all of that stuff. And then there are people within those that are actively combating and at odds with police and the FBI, et cetera. And those things exist sometimes within the same, the same general movements or parties or organizations. Yeah, absolutely. So that is the complexity of, and I do appreciate the work on the freeway fight. I think you guys have some more stuff coming out on that next year, possibly. But
yeah, there's going to be a new collection about the three-way fight analysis that I'm really looking forward to. And there's also Confronting Fascism, which discussion documents for militant movement, which is, for me, always a crucial reference for those sort of ideas about like not lumping all your enemies in together and understanding that like they too have politics and schisms and tensions among them.
Right on. So, obviously there was some hope, and McVeigh and Rolston talked about this a little bit, that like Brexit and some of the, issues that came up around that, which folks may not know too much about. We talked about a little bit in that discussion, but there was, debates about borders that came into play and about trade and, whether the North could remain in the EU, which I think it desired to do, even though Britain obviously did not. And, so there was like questions of imposing a border at the Irish Sea and these kind of discussions, which gave some folks some optimism that there could be a negotiation that would sort of basically incorporate the 6 counties somehow more directly with the counties in the South, which is always a, something that folks that are, deeply in the Republican movement or nationalist movement want, is to see one Ireland, right? And to not see this partition and the separation into 2 different states, essentially. Obviously, that has not, at least so far, come to pass. It seems like they've kind of been able to work out ways to sort of work around that tension. And that tension was interesting in part. We didn't talk about this a lot with them, but there was also interesting tensions among the loyalists, like sort of unionist sides of things there. Some of them actually got pretty militant around certain aspects of that. But anyways, I wonder if, you would have anything to add kind of on. I know you talk about some of these things within the conclusion, but just around really recent dynamics of the Irish Republican movement, to the extent that it still constitutes a movement, is not just sort of a political party at this point. And, I think you referred to the revolutionary potential certainly as being on ice in the current moment. And so, I'm just interested in some of the dynamics of Irish republicanism that led to that view, your view of that at this point in time. Obviously, you've alluded to a number of them. So, anything that you would want to add in closing?
I would maybe just say that you sort of said that thing about like republicanism, is it a movement or is it just a party? I would add a third option of like a culture. Like it really is, it's such a profoundly intergenerational cultural thing that is tied up with things about what sports you play and languages you speak. And some of that is, a major problem. Like one of the main social issues that gets talked about, like sectarianism is a problem in the North. And the structures have changed a lot, but the segregation between Protestants and Catholics is very stark. Like it's more stark than it was in the early 60s. And one of the ways that reproduces itself is that there's segregated schooling. You go to Catholic school or you go to public and or Protestant school, but public school is like functionally, I think they call them state schools because public schools are the fancy Eton or whatever. I don't understand the education system. It's kind of weird. But anyway, like, so people, like Protestants play rugby and Catholics play football, like Gaelic football or hurling or, and they learn Irish and all kinds of different things like that. And I think that for me speaks to the kind of, it's on ice, but it's on ice. It's not dead because it has such a long and deep-rooted culture of resistance, tradition of resistance, history of resistance. Like this has been one of my pieces of happiness in the last month, is discovering this Irish hip hop group Kneecap that raps half in Irish or sometimes entirely in Irish, and I am a weird nerd with a soft spot for Irish nationalism, so I checked them out. But part of what I find so exciting about it is that they don't really make sense in traditional kind of mainstream respectable republicanism. Most of what they talk about is doing drugs and hating the police, and they'll shout Brits out and Chuck Yar Law and there's the Republican slogans. But, they're talking in Irish about how they're looking forward to a united Ireland where weed is legal, and making fun of aspects of armed republicanism sometimes and endorsing it some other times. And I just really enjoy their music, but also I think it sort of testifies to the depth of this movement, that it's not confined to organizations. It's not confined to sort of like policy statements. And I think by the standards of the Republican movement, they're in some ways an embarrassment. And in other ways, of course, they're the greatest advertisement for it, or the greatest testament to the success of the movement, that there are these kids who grew up speaking Irish and are fluent in Irish, and they talk about what people talk about in any language that is a real language. They talk about doing drugs and having sex and getting mad at the cops, that's what you do in a real language. And I think their politics are unclear, other than like broadly Republican, but it's sort of this wellspring that a revolutionary anti-colonial movement could spring from, depending on the circumstances. Like, this was one of the things people were talking about with Brexit. Like, if they put a hard border between the 6 counties and the 26 counties, the military conflict will immediately restart. And everyone recognized that, and that's why they decided to put the border in the Irish Sea, which almost restarted an armed loyalist campaign. They were like threatening port workers and stuff and put up various threatening signs. And the DUP, the main loyalist party, is still refusing to enter the parliament in the North Stormont, which means that there's been no sitting legislature in the North, or that's been direct rule from London for, like a couple of years now, I think, or maybe a year and a half, and kind of no sign of ending. The reason I say it's on ice is because I am seduced by the romance of Irish nationalism, but politically, I am not a nationalist. I don't actually believe that it will benefit Irish people just if the map is drawn in a different way, or just if a different territory is claimed by the state. I think the same is true in Ireland as of elsewhere. We need a revolution of the economy. We need a revolution so that working people control their own conditions and can set about abolishing class society entirely. And I think a united Ireland in the sense of a 32 county republic is very closer than it's been in a long time. Not close in the sense of this year, but in like maybe this decade kind of thing. But the idea that would be more than an incorporation of the North into the South, as opposed to that idea of a revolution North and South, making of a new republic, I think there's no way that would happen. The things that are more likely to happen are concessions to the loyalist or the unionist community in the North, things about in terms of like maybe the flag would change, maybe the anthem would change, maybe things about the role of the Irish language would change, or those are the kind of concessions people are talking about to get a united Ireland. And that's fine. Like, I'm not, some of those might have my own personal opinions about, but it kind of doesn't matter. Like, it's a post-conflict society trying to manage post-conflict. And, as I say, like, an end to war is a good thing, removed from all other context. But like, I still think we need an anti-capitalist revolution. And I don't see where that's going to come from in the Irish context. I think people who are still organized are either fully behind parliamentary strategy of Sinn Féin, or they are supporting these kind of micro groups that are trying to maintain armed physical force republicanism as it looked in the 1980s. And I don't think that's viable. I think that's trying to just sort of LARP at something that ran its course and achieved some gains. And yeah, I don't see how just imitating the past like that is going to get anywhere. I think one of the strengths of the Irish struggle is that it draws so heavily on history, and history is so necessary for understanding and guiding revolutionary struggle. But if you just treat history as this kind of like yoke on your neck that weighs you down and not recognize the changes that come about over history, you're going to get confused and stuck in the past and stuck in this sort of like, we will just do this until the republic is achieved. We will just do this until the republic is achieved.
Casey, thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to say in closing? I appreciate this conversation a lot, and definitely encourage people to check out the book and go to leftwingbooks.net and check out the rest of the catalog and all of that. But yeah, anything you want to say in closing?
If you live in Canada, the United States, you live in a settler colony, and if you're inspired by the Irish struggle, you should be fighting the colonial situation you live in, and maybe learning more from how you think settlers in the north of Ireland should have been acting politically, rather than what you pretending you're in the IRA or whatever. I think a lot of the things I've been saying are really influenced by the work of Don Hammerquist in terms of looking at what's new and being sensitive to the changes of the capitalist system over time and the structure of imperialism over time. I think, selfish plug, or not selfish because it's not me, but a book we put out is a brilliant red thread by him, and I think it's really great. I think there's a lot to learn from in there for revolutionaries.
Yeah, awesome. And I think that, that book, as well as a lot of what you all do, and this one too, like it highlights kind of the niche I see you all filling kind of as a radical press, which is that you bring in stuff from folks from like Maoist or Marxist Leninist backgrounds that are like self-critical as well as critical of other movements, and things from an anarchistic background that are also self-critical and critical of other movements. And so there's just a lot there within that catalog. Also a lot of stuff from the New African movement or folks that are in solidarity with that, where, I think you get a level of honesty, again, of like serious, like not criticism, self-criticism in a sort of the way that can play out very dogmatically and, contentiously sometimes, but also like really trying to take sober assessments of movements, of change, of the need to sometimes, innovate some, break out of stale patterns, etc., but also be thoughtful about that and not also think that you have to throw everything out, right, and start all over and develop a new theory every time and that kind of stuff. And so I think there's a lot in one of the reasons I talk to friends, and one of the reasons that I recommend a lot of books that are in your catalog is for that reason, is that I don't find texts that are like, just written by a specific party in an organization and saying like, this is our line, this is the way we do it, this is, basically party propaganda. And I don't mean that in a negative sense to criticize parties who create propaganda. That's part of their role, but also just to understand that there are people who operate in organizations, operate in parties, and have been in those, and who have shared their own reflections of, stuff they thought worked well or had potential, didn't work out, or stuff that, they think is flawed. And I think those types of criticisms, especially for us as we're all still learning, but for younger radicals and stuff like that, it's just important to kind of at least pair with the other stuff to have space, I think, to enter into conversations and debates and things like that with people, however you organize, which I encourage people to organize, especially, always, but in times like these too, to be able to have stuff that's critical, self-critical, and really trying to take those sober assessments and analyses and think about, how do we strengthen and move forward, and, so all of that, like, I just appreciate that about you all as a press, that commitment to kind of, I would say, non-sectarianism, but also not a fear of like, we're not going to publish this because it's critical of certain things that, we might have some loyalties to or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks. Yep. Yeah, that's what I like about it too. That's why I got involved.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Casey. I appreciate it. I've taken up a lot of your time today, and appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. Free Palestine.
Free Palestine.